So I think what you said just now also resonating with me. A lot of leadership coaching program, training program, we are all taught about how to be more effective, be it time management, communication, influencing skills, presentation, the list goes on and on. But I think what you said just now is very interesting, right? That we should also focus or even focus more on our being, not just the doing part. And you call this concept the elevated leader. So maybe first of all, try to explain what is the concept of elevated leader and why we actually need to focus on being an elevated leader, or what you say here, focus on the being.
Yeah, so the concepts behind vertical development. So vertical development, if you've never heard of it, it's a fairly new term. It's been around for about 10 years. But the ideas behind it go back to the 1960s, and they stem from the field of developmental psychology. So let me just give you a really brief history lesson around developmental psychology. Developmental psychology started as a field of study in the 1880s. From the 1880s until the 1960s, the primary focus of developmental psychologists was on children and their development. In fact, they largely assumed that adults, when people hit adulthood, they don't develop. But what we learned from these scholars is that as people go from infants to adults, they go through a number of different developmental stages, and they do so rather automatically. It's essentially a function of age. Well, in the 1960s, a select few developmental psychologists started to wonder, do adults develop? And if so, do they develop through different developmental stages? And what they found in their research was really fascinating. So what they found is that yes, adults can develop, and that there are 3 different developmental stages. But what they also found was that most adults never develop. So they identify these 3 different developmental stages, and what they've found is that 64% of all adults never develop into the second level of adult development during their adulthood, during their lifetime. So 35% end up getting to the second level of adult development, and only 1% get to the third level of adult development. And so when we talk about an elevated leader, we're talking about how do we go through the process for ourselves to develop vertically as adults and ultimately, hopefully, get to that highest level. Because when we learn about that highest level, what we'll find is that the most effective people are the types of people who have developed to that level. When we think about actually some of the biggest names in our world's history, people like Mahatma Gandhi, Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela, these are types of people that show a lot of evidence as operating at that highest vertical development level. So for me, what I found is that it's just been really eye-opening to understand what are these different levels, because it gets me a sense of, well, what is my vertical altitude? And how do I elevate?
Thanks for sharing this. I was quite intrigued by these statistic numbers that you quoted. I also found it in the book. Like 64% of people actually are only still in first stage. Less of them actually move to the next stages. And this is very interesting because the fact in the industry, we have many of such people, right? Which means that we have probably some leaders who have not been developed or elevated, so to speak. And I think in the book also you mentioned it's pretty rare if we can find a team that is in a better psychological state than its leader. So the leader's position, the leader's role is actually very crucial in any kind of team and hence the company or organization. So there are also some statistics that you quoted about if a manager is not effective or not elevated, it impacts the team. Maybe you can share some interesting statistics here for us to know why this is such an important thing.
Here's what I think is helpful to realize is that the leader of an organization or even of a group, their vertical altitude sets the ceiling for how effective that organization or that team can be. And so if we ever want to improve the effectiveness of an organization or a team, what we have to do at a foundational level is help that leader develop vertically. Because when leaders operate from lower altitudes, they end up implementing tactics or making certain decisions and implementing certain policies that, while may serve some benefit, are ultimately limiting for that organization. So let me give you maybe a quick example of that. And I would say Microsoft is a company that most people around the world are familiar with. When I studied Microsoft leaders, particularly Steve Ballmer, the CEO before Satya Nadella, Microsoft is a completely different company now under Satya Nadella than under Steve Ballmer. And what I would venture to say is that Satya Nadella, in my study of him, is a very vertically developed leader. Steve Ballmer, on the other hand, wasn't as vertically developed. Let me give you an example of some evidence of that. One of the things that Steve Ballmer did is he implemented stacked ranked performance management systems. These performance management systems are designed to help identify the top talent in the organization and kind of treat them in a special way. That's great because what Steve Ballmer was all about was about how do we stand out? And a stacked rate performance management system helps him identify those who stand out. But what he didn't fully appreciate was when you create or utilize a stack rate performance management system, what that actually does is it fosters a culture of competition as opposed to collaboration. And so even though Steve Ballmer was really well intended, what he was doing was ultimately putting a cap on the effectiveness of Microsoft. That under Ballmer, they were just not able to be very innovative. And so when Satya Nadella comes in as CEO, he says the C in CEO stands for curator of culture. And one of the first things that he did was he threw out the stack rate performance management system to create an environment that was much more collaborative as opposed to competitive. And that's fueled a huge amount of growth in Microsoft since Satya Nadella took over. So you asked about some statistics. That's kind of an anecdote. But what we find is there's statistics that suggest 65% of employees would rather have a new boss over more pay. 85% of employees don't trust their leaders to tell the truth. So these are a couple of statistics that demonstrate that, unfortunately, most leaders don't operate from a really high level of vertical development or altitude.
Thanks for sharing that study case for Steve Ballmer and implementing stack rank simply because he has a well-intentioned strategy, but actually his maybe leadership stage actually kept the thinking behind the intention implementing the stack rank. And I think we can see many leaders as well if we are stuck in this kind of a mindset. And maybe we also implementing decisions or maybe treating people that is probably not optimal. I guess many people also say you don't leave the job unless you are not happy with your manager, right? So a lot of things actually hinge on the optimal relationship with the manager. So I think this is really important for us to learn from you, right? So how we can elevate ourselves as leader as well. By elevating, you also mentioned there's this vertical development and there's also the opposite of that, which is horizontal development. Maybe let's go there and try to explain the distinction between these two, horizontal and vertical development.
Yeah, really good. So it's just helpful to recognize, and just most people aren't familiar with this, is that there's two different forms of development. There's horizontal development and there's vertical development. And we are very well versed in horizontal development. This is the primary form of development of our education systems and our corporate training programs. So horizontal development is adding new knowledge and skills and competencies to ourselves. The focus is on doing more. And there's nothing wrong with horizontal development. It's a lot like downloading an app onto an iPad. When I put a new app onto an iPad, that's great because it allows me to do more than what I could do previously. But what we've got to ask ourselves is, does having a new app improve how effectively that iPad operates as a whole? Answer to that question is no, of course not. Adding a new app isn't going to help the iPad operate more quickly, do more complex things. But if we want that, we can't use horizontal development. We've got to employ a different developmental approach, and that is vertical development. So vertical development is not helping us to do more. It's helping us to be better. And the focus is not on adding an app onto the iPad. It's upgrading our own internal operating system. It's upgrading our being. So that's what vertical development is all about. Hopefully that analogy helps explain why it's so important. And let me even try to drive that point home. Downstairs, I have an iPad that is about 8.5 years old. When I pull it up, I could go to the App Store and I could try to download an app. And every time I try to do it, I get an error. The error says this app cannot be downloaded onto this iPad because the operating system is too old. It doesn't say it that way, but that's effectively what's going on. And so am unable to download new apps. Well, when you think about corporate training, for example, we may want to develop leaders' emotional intelligence, and we could put them through a horizontal development approach that might say, well, let's have you go to this training on how to listen more effectively or how to deliver feedback more effectively. Those are kind of doing horizontal type trainings. And those might be incrementally helpful. But if the individual, as a part of this development, if their internal operating system is wired such that they have a really hard time even listening to the ideas of others, maybe because they have their own insecurities about how they always have to be the one with the right answers, then that training on how to listen more effectively isn't going to work. The operating system that individual has is not compatible with that app that they're trying to download. So that's one of the biggest limitations that I see in terms of leadership and employee development is too often we're trying to download apps that are more sophisticated than the individual's operating system to begin with. And so the whole idea here is not to say horizontal development is bad. Just the idea is that we also need to consider vertical development and the operating system so that we can better develop ourselves as leaders. And then so that we could even grow. Here's the argument that I'm somewhat trying to make. As we grow vertically, we enhance our capacity to grow horizontally. I don't think it's the same the other way around. I don't think by having more horizontal development necessarily helps us vertically develop.
Wow, that's an interesting analogy, like downloading an app or upgrading your iPad OS, so this internal operating system that you mentioned. So I think it makes sense to me why vertical development is important. And just now you've also mentioned that if we elevate ourselves in terms of vertical development, we can also enhance our capacity to develop horizontally. So I think that's also a very interesting concept.